My name is Jude Pickering. I'm 47 years old, and for a long time I kept a blue binder in the bottom drawer of my locker at Adena Riverview Medical Center. It was the only copy of the maintenance reports the CEO told me to shred. The month I started hiding it, 3 dialysis patients died in that unit. He called it a rough quarter. Then the scheduler called me at home. She said my own mother was being moved onto that same dialysis floor the following Tuesday. That's the night I opened the binder. Months later, I was sitting across from a federal prosecutor, and the man who told me once that I was not the brain of the hospital, I was the wrench, couldn't open his own office door anymore. There's a conversation I had with a nurse named Ilana in a third-floor supply room. A federal prosecutor who showed me a signature I didn't know existed. And the moment my mother asked me, "Jude, is the water at that hospital safe?" If you want to be here for all of it, hit subscribe and drop a like. Stories like this one don't make it off the ground without you. While you're here, I'm curious. How many people inside that hospital do you think knew and stayed quiet? Drop a guess where you're watching from. I'll tell you what the real number turned out to be. Let me take you back to the first Tuesday in February, the day I found the first report. So, I moved to Chillicothe in 2012 because the job at Adena Riverview came with full benefits and my wife was pregnant with our daughter. I'm a biomedical equipment technician. My job is to fix and maintain the machines that keep people alive. Dialysis units, ventilators, infusion pumps. For the first 10 years, it was the best job I ever had. Mirella Voss was one of the first patients I met on the dialysis floor. She was 58. Ran the Thursday afternoon story hour at the Chillicothe Public Library for 22 years. She used to bring me blueberry muffins on Tuesdays. Said it was because Tuesdays are brutal if you don't get ahead of them. I ate a lot of blueberry muffins. Mirella died on February 12th, 2024, in treatment chair 6. She wasn't supposed to. Her kidneys were stable. 3 days later, a veteran named Rhett Chalmers died in the chair next to hers. Then a factory nurse named Odalis Mercado lost consciousness in the waiting room and never woke up. 3 patients, 10 days, same unit. Gavin Holcomb, the hospital CEO, sent out an internal memo that called it a statistical anomaly and announced a grief counselor would be available in the chapel. Anomaly. That was the word he used. The blue binder in my locker already had 41 pages in it by then. I just hadn't opened it in a while. And I need to back up a second because I don't want you thinking I was some noble soul from day one. I wasn't. I'm the guy who kept the binder. I didn't go to the press. I didn't call the state. I did my job, kept my head down, and put copies of every suppressed maintenance report into a locker in the basement because, honestly, I don't even know what I thought I was going to do with them. I think I just couldn't bring myself to throw them away. What I didn't know on February 12th was that the page Mirella's name would be attached to was already in that locker. I just hadn't connected the dots yet. The day after Mirella died, I walked the water treatment room. Our dialysis unit runs on what's called a water reclamation loop, a system that purifies tap water until it's cleaner than bottled water before it touches a patient's bloodstream. If that water isn't clean, people die. Not eventually. That day. That treatment. I know every inch of that system because I'm the one who maintains it. Or, I'm the one who's supposed to. The logbook was sitting on the desk next to the reverse osmosis unit. I flipped it open and saw something I'd seen a lot of over the previous 18 months. A whole column of entries in a handwriting that wasn't mine, confirming that tests had been done and passed, on days I knew the tests hadn't happened. My own initials forged in 3 places. I should have gone to HR right then. I didn't. I'll tell you why in a minute. First, I want to tell you what the water smelled like that morning, because this detail, it stayed with me. The room was warm from the heat exchangers. The air had a faint metallic edge, like a penny you've been holding in your fist. That's not how clean dialysis water smells. Clean water doesn't smell like anything. I stood there with my hand on one of the reverse osmosis housings, and I could feel the vibration through my palm. That vibration was wrong. I've been feeling it wrong for months. It was running at a frequency that told me the membranes hadn't been swapped. You can hear it if you know the system. A low hum instead of the clean tick. Most people wouldn't notice. I noticed every time I walked in that room, and I still didn't say anything. I went back upstairs and found the nurse manager, Ilana Delacroix. She was in the break room stirring a coffee she hadn't taken a sip of yet. She looked up, saw my face, and said, "Not here." She was 44, Cuban grandmother, Louisiana mother, raised in Dayton. She had worked on that dialysis floor for 16 years, and she had the kind of eyes that registered a body going south about a minute before the monitors did. She was the only person in that building I trusted, and I didn't even fully trust her yet. I trusted her enough to follow her into a supply room. That was the threshold I was working with. We walked into the supply room on the 3rd floor. She closed the door. 4, she said. 4 what? 4 patients in 9 days, Jude. Morella, Rhett, Odalis, and a 4th patient. A man in his 70s who they're saying went into cardiac arrest, but I was in that room. My hand went still on the shelf of saline bags. Just still. Not calm. Quiet. Holcomb's calling it an anomaly, I said. She looked at me for a long second. Then she said the thing I'd been afraid to admit to myself for a year and a half. Jude, the water. That was it. 2 words. I said, I know. Except I'm not sure I really did. I'd known something was wrong. I hadn't let myself know what. She told me she'd been keeping her own log of patient symptoms for 6 months. Not in the hospital system. In a spiral notebook she kept in her car. Cognitive fog in patients whose labs didn't support it. Neuropathy. Anemia that wasn't tracking with kidney numbers. She said she'd charted it by chair number and treatment date, and the pattern was always the same. Chairs connected to the older outflow loops, the ones running through the sections of pipe I'd been flagging for replacement since 2022. She said one of the techs, a young guy named Corey, had asked Holcomb in an all-staff meeting the previous summer whether the reclamation system needed emergency service. She said Holcomb answered in a voice so calm it scared her. Everybody who works on the 3rd floor, Holcomb had said, understands that we're operating in a rough financial environment, and everybody on the 3rd floor has bills. That's a threat wrapped in a shrug. I went home that night, and I looked at my daughter doing her homework at the kitchen table, and I thought about calling the state. I didn't. What I did was put Corey's name in the blue binder, and then I went into the basement locker, and I counted the pages for the first time since November. 41 going on 42. By the end of February, there were 6. 6 dialysis patients dead in a unit that typically sees 1 or 2 a year. The hospital put out a press release announcing a quality review initiative. Holcomb did a sit-down with the local paper where he wore a blue tie and talked about how much he valued transparency. Transparency. Here's what transparency looked like from inside. Holcomb sent an email to all unit managers with the subject line, Narrative Discipline. In it, he asked that any staff questions about recent patient outcomes be routed directly to the administrator's office. He wrote, quote, "Speculation is not a clinical act. That's an actual sentence that actual human being typed and sent." Ilana forwarded me a copy. I printed it. Blue binder. Let me tell you about my mother for a second, because this is where she comes in. Her name is Marlene. She was 69, lived alone in a ranch house on the east side of Chillicothe, played bridge on Wednesdays with 3 women she'd known since Girl Scouts. She'd been managing stage 3 kidney disease for about 6 years, and her nephrologist had always said she'd probably stay in the conservative management window for another decade. Then her labs crashed the first week of March. The scheduler at Adina called me at work. She said, "Good news, Jude. We got your mom in quickly. First session's next Tuesday, 7 a.m., chair 4. And in the part of my brain that maintains the equipment, I remember thinking, chair 4 runs on the same outflow loop as chair 6. That's the loop Morella died on. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time that afternoon. I'm going to stop here for a second, because the weight of what I was sitting with, I don't think I've ever described it to anyone before. I don't know what it was. It wasn't anger, I know that. Fear was closer, but not right either. It was just this flat, sick feeling. My mother was going to sit in chair 4 on a Tuesday morning, and I'd been pretending this wasn't my problem for a year and a half. Have you ever had that moment where the problem you've been pretending doesn't belong to you walks into your own house? If you have, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one who spent a long time pretending. The night after that call, my mother came over for dinner. She was already talking about Tuesday like it was nothing. Annoying, but fine. She asked my wife about the vegetable garden. She asked my daughter about her spelling test. And then, while my wife was clearing plates, she looked at me and said, "Jude, is the water at that hospital safe?" I looked at my daughter. I looked at my mother. I said, "Mom, let me get back to you on Tuesday." She said, "On Tuesday, I'll already be there." My daughter was at the other end of the table working on her math homework. She held up her worksheet and said, "Dad, is 11 times 12 132? I said, "Yeah, honey, that's right." She went back to her pencil. She was 10. She didn't know what we were talking about. She was just doing her homework at a kitchen table in a house where the lights were on and nobody was yelling. That night, after my mother left and my daughter went to bed, I noticed something on my way to the truck. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was open. Not broken, just open. I hadn't checked the mail that day. Neither had my wife. Probably wind, probably nothing. I stood there looking at it for about a minute longer than a person should look at an open mailbox. I went to the basement, opened the locker, opened the binder. I need to tell you what I thought was going on, because I was wrong. My first theory was a guy named Corey, the young tech who'd asked the question in the staff meeting. He'd been running the maintenance shifts when the system had started sliding. Half the forged initials in the logbook were forged in a handwriting that looked like his, and a couple of the water quality reports that had gone missing had been flagged during his rotations. I want to be honest with you. I went after Corey for about 8 days. I started with the shift records. I went down to the HR office on my lunch break, this cramped room on the first floor with file cabinets going back to 2008, and I pulled the maintenance rotation schedules for the previous 2 years. Corey's name was on 8 of the 12 weeks where the logbook entries had been forged. That looked bad. Then I matched the schedules against the patient mortality dates. 2 deaths had happened during Corey's maintenance windows, 1 during mine. 2 during windows where neither of us was logged. I was building a case in my head, and I wanted it to be clean. The next thing I did was go to the supply room where the water quality reports were stored, a closet between radiology and the janitorial office. And I asked the records clerk if she had copies of the quarterly test submissions from 2022 and 2023. She said she'd look. She looked for about 20 minutes while I stood in the hallway pretending to check my phone. She came back and said the 2022 submissions had been removed from the binder, and she didn't know by whom. That was a dead end. I spent an afternoon on it and got nothing. I pulled Corey's personnel file next. Or I tried. I went to the unit supervisor's office on a Thursday morning and asked if I could see Corey's incident reports, framing it as a maintenance audit question. The supervisor looked at me for a beat too long and said, "Corey doesn't have incident reports, Jude. He has a transfer." She didn't elaborate. I didn't push. Then I went to find Corey himself, and I couldn't. He'd been quietly reassigned to the imaging department 2 weeks after asking the question in the staff meeting. I walked over to imaging, and there he was. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked like he'd been expecting someone to finally walk over. I asked him if he had 5 minutes. He said, "No." I said, "Corey, I just need to know if—" He looked at the floor. He didn't say another word. I stood there for probably 15 seconds waiting for him to look back up, and he didn't. That silence told me more than anything he could have said. I walked back to the elevator. That was it. That was a dead end. I thought I'd been following the real trail. I hadn't. And I want to say, that would have been easier for everybody. One bad apple, one check written, building stays standing. Nobody loses a job who didn't already lose one. What actually happened was that 2 nights later, I met Holcomb in the hallway outside the administrator's office. He saw me. He did the thing he always did, the warm hand on the shoulder, the half smile, and he said, "Jude, my man, how's the mother?" I said she was fine. He said, "You know what I always appreciated about you? You understand how a hospital actually works. The doctors think they run this place. The board thinks they run this place. But guys like you and me, we know. You're not the brain of this hospital, Jude. You're the wrench. And wrenches don't ask the brain what it's doing." He patted my shoulder, walked away. I stood in that hallway and I felt something I hadn't felt in 18 months of keeping that binder. I was angry. Not scared, not guilty, angry. He had just called me the wrench, to my face, while my mother was scheduled for chair 4. That was a Thursday, so there I was, at 47 years old, a wrench. I went home that Thursday night, sat at the kitchen table, opened the binder for the first time under a real light, and I started going through it page by page. Not to read it, to build a timeline. Which pages were mine, which had been handed to me by Ilana, which had been quietly left on my desk by Corey in the month before he got reassigned. I'd been looking at it as a pile of evidence. It wasn't a pile. It was a pattern. And the pattern had a signature on it. On page 34, there was a memo dated October 4th, 2022, authorizing the temporary deferral of quarterly RO membrane replacement and reverse osmosis validation testing, pending quarterly budget reconciliation. The authorization line had a signature on it. Gavin Holcomb, Chief Executive Officer, Adena Riverview Medical Center. October 2022 is when the forged initials in the logbook started. The memo was a one-page document, but the thing that stayed with me, underneath Holcomb's signature, in smaller type was a line that read, "See Budget Correspondence August 14th, 2022 for projected impact." I didn't pull the budget correspondence that night. I wrote the date on a Post-it and stuck it to the inside cover of the binder. 3 months later, a federal prosecutor would pull it for me. Let me say that again, because when I realized it, I had to read it 3 times. The man who called the deaths an anomaly in 2024 had signed the memo in 2022 that made the anomaly mathematically inevitable. I stood up from the kitchen table, and I walked to the sink, and I held on to it for a minute. I think I laughed. I don't actually remember. I might have said something out loud to nobody. I had gone 18 months thinking Holcomb was covering something up that had happened to him. It hadn't happened to him. He had done it. I'm going to stop the story here for a second, because I want to ask you something. If you'd been me, sitting at that kitchen table, with a mother scheduled for chair 4 the following week, and a signature that proves your boss signed the memo that killed 6 people, what do you do? Do you drive to the state health department that night? Do you call your wife into the room? Do you pick up the phone and call the FBI? Or do you do what I almost did, which is close the binder and decide this is somebody else's problem? I'd genuinely like to know what you'd have done. What I did was pick up the phone and call Ilana. She answered on the 3rd ring. She was in her car in the parking lot at Walmart. I could hear her turn the engine off. I said, "It's Holcomb." She said, "I know." I said, "Since 2022. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Jude, do you know how many?" I didn't understand the question at first. She said it again, slower. "Do you know how many it is?" I did not. The number she was about to say to me was going to change the rest of my life. But she didn't say it that night. She said, "Not over the phone. Come to my house tomorrow." The next morning, she opened her door in a sweatshirt, handed me a stack of patient records, and said, 23 patients in 18 months. I need to tell you what Holcomb said to me at my mother's pre-dialysis consult that Friday, which happened to be the same day Ilana handed me that stack. He came by the waiting room because that's what he did. He was a walk-the-floors CEO. And he saw my mother, and he sat down next to her, and he took her hand, and he said, "Marlene, you're in the best hands in Ohio." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Holcomb." He said, "Please, Gavin." Then he looked up at me over her head, and he said to me without changing his smile, "Jude, your mother's going to get the treatment she deserves." I went home that Friday night. I made a list of what I had, 43 pages,
The signed memo, the forged logs, Ilana's notes, 23 names, 23. And I realized I'd been keeping a binder in a locker for 18 months because some part of me already knew. Saturday morning, I called a federal tip line. The woman who answered sounded tired and took down my number. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for maybe 2 hours before the phone rang. A man on the other end identified himself as a special agent with the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General. He didn't tell me how my report had moved that fast. I didn't ask. He asked me 2 questions. He asked me how many documents I had. I said 43. He asked me how many patient names. I said 23. He said, "Don't come to the hospital Monday."
He said, "Bring everything you have to the downtown Federal Building at 9 a.m. Tuesday morning, top floor. Ask for me by name." I said, "My mother is scheduled for dialysis Tuesday at 7 a.m. There was a pause on the phone. He said, "Sir, with respect, cancel that appointment." I hung up and I sat in my driveway in my truck for what was probably 20 minutes. Then I went inside and I told my wife for the first time that there was a blue binder in the locker. She didn't say anything for a long minute. Then she said, "How long?" I said, 18 months. She said, "Jude." And then she said, "Okay, let's go get your mother." That's the part of this story I'll remember when I'm old. Not the Federal Building, not Holcomb. Just my wife saying, "Let's go get your mother." Monday morning, my wife packed a thermos, and we drove my mother to a dialysis unit at a hospital about an hour north, in a town called Circleville. My mother sat in the back seat and told us about a billboard she'd seen on Route 23 advertising a psychic who specialized in pet readings. She said, "I'd pay $20 to know what Mr. Tibbs really thinks about the wet food." My wife laughed. I didn't, but I wanted to. On the drive up, my wife reached over and put her hand on mine on the gear shift. She didn't say anything, she just left it there. I sat in the waiting room for 4 hours. When my mother came out, she looked at the water fountain in the lobby and said, "The water smelled like nothing." She meant it as a joke. I didn't laugh. But my wife caught my eye across the waiting room, and I saw something in her face that was close to relief. The Circleville Hospital lobby smelled like floor wax and nothing else. That was enough. On the drive home, my mother fell asleep in the back seat. My wife's hand found mine again on the gear shift. We didn't talk about what was coming tomorrow. We just drove. Monday afternoon, I took a personal day from work. Tuesday morning at 8:48 a.m., I walked into the downtown Federal Building with a shopping bag containing the blue binder, Ilana's patient logs, and a thumb drive with photos of every page in case they took my bag. I rode the elevator to the top floor. The agent met me at reception and walked me down a carpeted hallway to a conference room. The carpet was gray. The room smelled like copier toner and old coffee. There was a water pitcher on the table and 4 glasses. And I remember looking at the water and thinking about how clean it was and not wanting to drink it. There were 4 people in that room, an HHS agent, an FBI agent from the Healthcare Fraud Unit, a state health department investigator, and an assistant United States attorney who didn't look up from her legal pad for about 90 seconds while I stood there. I set the blue binder on the table. I sat down. The AUSA looked up and said, "Mr. Pickering, walk us through page 1. We were there for 11 hours. At some point around 4 in the afternoon, I'll never forget this, the HHS agent excused himself, walked out of the room, and I heard him in the hallway on the phone asking someone, "How fast can we get a federal subpoena served on an acting hospital CEO today?" By 8 o'clock that night, the state health department had issued an emergency suspension order on the dialysis unit at Adena Riverview Medical Center. Federal agents were serving Gavin Holcomb a subpoena in his office. Ilana texted me at 8:41 p.m. It was a photo of Holcomb through the open door of his office, sitting at his desk with his hands flat on the blotter and his face completely white. She wrote, "He's looking at the door like he doesn't recognize it. I want you to understand something. I thought that was the end. I thought I'd walk into work Wednesday morning and be the guy who did the right thing, and the hospital would be in federal receivership, and Holcomb would be quietly packing up his office, and we'd move on. That's not what happened. Not even close. What happened is that when the story hit the Chillicothe Gazette on Thursday morning, I was identified by name as a disgruntled former maintenance employee with a history of workplace complaints. That's a direct quote from the hospital's public relations statement. Former. I hadn't been fired. I hadn't quit. What they'd done was, between Wednesday morning and Thursday morning, Holcomb's chief of staff had backdated a termination letter to the previous Friday, cited theft of hospital documents as the cause, and had a temp walk over to my locker in the basement and empty it onto a cart. The binder was already in federal custody, of course, they knew that. The theft wasn't the point. The label was the point. Then a second statement went out, naming me as a disgruntled employee whose mother was the subject of a scheduling grievance. You understand what that means?
They framed me as a man who made up 23 deaths because I didn't like my mother's dialysis schedule. I read that statement in my driveway in the morning paper and I laughed. My wife came out in her bathrobe. She read it over my shoulder. She didn't say anything for a minute. Then she went inside and called her sister. I stood in the driveway and listened to her voice through the screen door. Not the words, just the sound. And it hit me that I'd done something to her life that I couldn't undo. I had made the right call. I still believe that. But I had made it for both of us, and I hadn't asked. That afternoon, our car got keyed. Down both sides. The garage door had a brick leaning against it that hadn't been there that morning. My daughter's bike had been moved to the front yard. None of these things individually was a crime you could prosecute. All of them together were a message. 2 days later, a manila envelope showed up in the mailbox. No return address. Inside was a printout of my home address, my wife's maiden name, and the name and address of my daughter's school. Nothing else. No note. Just the information, laid out on a single sheet, like somebody wanted me to know they had it. That night, an unknown number called at 1:14 a.m. No voicemail. Called again at 1:26, and again at 1:43. My wife took the phone off the hook after the third one. She looked at me in the dark and said, "Jude, what are we going to do?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Okay," and she rolled over and didn't sleep. I know because I didn't sleep either, and I could hear her breathing, and it wasn't sleep breathing. I want to tell you what a moral gray zone looks like in real time. It looks like sitting at your kitchen table at 3 a.m., looking at your daughter's bike in the front yard and thinking very seriously about withdrawing my statement. Taking the money they were already leaking through back channels they could make go away. Moving to Indiana. I actually Googled how to retract federal testimony that night. I want to be honest with you about that. I didn't do it, but I want you to know that I thought about it. This is the part where most people stop telling the story. The ones who made it this far, hit subscribe. I want you here for what comes next. The next morning, a reporter, I'm not going to say her name because she asked me not to, and she was right to. A reporter from the Columbus paper knocked on my door and said, "Mr. Pickering, don't talk, just listen. There's a version of the hospital's story landing in tomorrow's paper that's going to ruin you. I have a different version. I'd like to give you 30 minutes to decide if you want to sit for an interview." I didn't answer her that morning. I called my wife into the kitchen. I asked her what we should do. She said, "We already know what we're doing, Jude. We decided in the driveway Tuesday." I called the reporter back at 10:14 a.m. I said yes. The article ran Saturday. The hospital's narrative collapsed inside of 6 hours. But Holcomb wasn't done. Here's the part most people don't know. The man who had told me I was the wrench now needed the wrench to stop turning. Every document in my blue binder was the only chain of evidence connecting him to those deaths. The hospital's own email archive had been subpoenaed, but without the maintenance records I'd kept, the federal case had no inside narrator. He knew it. And for 11 months, he spent every waking hour trying to either buy me, bury me, or brand me. First, he tried to get the federal investigation reframed as a billing dispute. He hired a second legal team, not his defense attorneys, a separate firm that specialized in regulatory appeals. And they filed a motion arguing that the deferred maintenance was a routine fiscal decision within the CEO's operational discretion, and that patient outcomes fell under clinical malpractice, not federal fraud jurisdiction. The motion was denied in 9 days. The Assistant United States Attorney filed a response that was 11 pages long. I've never read it, but Ilana told me the last paragraph used the phrase, cynical recharacterization. That was not a woman who was going to let this become a billing case. Second, he tried to destroy the original hospital records. This I know because one of the IT contractors at the hospital got subpoenaed in August, and he testified that he'd been asked on a Friday afternoon in May to clear the pre-2023 network archive. The contractor said he'd asked for a written authorization. Holcomb told him it was a verbal directive from the board. The contractor said, "Then I'll need it from the board." Holcomb said, "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." The contractor said no. He still works at the hospital. Holcomb does not.
Third, he tried to offer settlements to 6 of the 23 families who hadn't even filed lawsuits yet, with non-disclosure agreements built in. 3 of them signed. 3 of them didn't, because Ilana went to their houses one by one in her own time and told them what had actually happened. She drove to 3 different towns in one weekend. She paid for the gas herself. Ilana lost her job for that in July. The hospital cited unauthorized disclosure of protected health information. She has never, to this day, told me she regrets it. Then he tried one more thing. He tried me. In September, a woman I'd worked with in medical records 12 years earlier called to tell me a federal investigator had been by her office asking about a workplace dispute between me and a female coworker in 2014 that, she said, had never happened. She said the investigator had a folder with my name on the tab and a photo of me from the hospital's HR file clipped to the front. She wanted me to know somebody was building a story. I drove home from the clinic that afternoon, and I sat in the truck in my own driveway for about 10 minutes. 4 tactics, 11 months, legal maneuvers, evidence destruction, family settlements, and now a fabricated personnel complaint from a decade ago. I thought about the binder. I thought about the 43 pages. I thought about Holcomb telling me I was the wrench. And I thought, the thing about a wrench is, once you start turning, the bolt doesn't get to decide when you stop. Would you have walked into a federal grand jury, knowing the man you were testifying against was spending every waking hour trying to destroy your name? I sat in my truck in that parking lot for a long time before I opened the door. What came out of that grand jury room is the part I still don't know how to live with. The grand jury met in November. I testified for 3 days. The first 2 were about the equipment. The third one was about Holcomb. And on the 3rd day, I walked into the grand jury room with a spiral notebook that Ilana had given me the night before, a notebook she'd kept since 2022, with the name of every patient she'd watched decompensate on the dialysis floor, because of the water, written in her own handwriting, 23 names, in her handwriting. On the last page, she had written, "I should have said something in 2022. I'm saying it now." I'm going to tell you how the grand jury ended, but I want to take you inside the deposition Holcomb sat for first, because this is where it actually cracked. His lawyer was a man who specialized in administrative defense, which means keeping hospital executives out of prison. Good suits, patient voice. He wanted Holcomb to stick to a single story, that the deferred maintenance memo was a routine budget document, that he hadn't understood its clinical implications, that the 23 outcomes were unfortunate and unforeseeable, and that I was a disgruntled employee with a personal grievance. Holcomb couldn't stick to it, because on the 4th hour of the deposition, the AUSA slid a document across the table and said, "Mr. Holcomb, can you identify this?" It was a printed email from Gavin Holcomb to the hospital's chief financial officer, dated August 14th, 2022. 2 months before the authorization memo. I had written the date on a post-it 3 months earlier. I'd never pulled the document itself. The AUSA had. It had been pulled out of the hospital's own email archive by federal subpoena, the same email archive Holcomb had tried to have scrubbed in May.
The IT contractor who refused him was sitting in the AUSA's witness roster for afternoon testimony. In it, Holcomb had written, "If we defer the RO validation for 4 quarters, we save about $91,000. My projection is we'll see elevated adverse events on the dialysis floor, but it will be attributable to patient comorbidities. We recover the revenue and absorb the exposure. Worst case, we lose Medicare cert for 30 days, which we budget for." He typed that. Elevated adverse events. That was his phrase. Absorb the exposure. Let me tell you, because this is a detail I'll never let go of. On page 3 of that email, in the paragraph where he laid out his projection, he wrote a specific number. He projected, and I'm quoting now, approximately 20 to 25 adverse outcomes over the deferment window. He had projected 23 deaths. When the AUSA slid that email across the table, Holcomb's lawyer asked for a recess. Holcomb got up. He walked out of the deposition room, and on his way out he said, and I have this from the transcript, he said, "I did what the board asked me to do." The AUSA's written response is one line. No board meeting minutes reflect any such request, Mr. Holcomb. Please be seated. They recessed for 10 minutes. When he came back in, something had changed in his face. I wasn't in the room, but Ilana was. She'd been called as the next witness. She told me later that when Holcomb walked back in, he looked at her across the room, and for 1 second, he wasn't a CEO anymore. Just a man. Scared. Regretting. She said she almost felt sorry for him. And then she said she thought about Mirella Voss, and she didn't. Ilana testified for 2 hours after that. She told me later that the hardest part wasn't the questions. It was watching the jurors' faces when she read the names from her notebook. She said one woman in the front row closed her eyes at name 11 and didn't open them again until Ilana said 23. She said another juror, a man about my age, put his hand over his mouth at some point and left it there. She said the room was the quietest room she'd ever been in, and she grew up going to Catholic Mass. That night, I drove home alone. I got about halfway and I had to pull over. I don't know how to tell you what it felt like. I sat in the truck on the shoulder of Route 35 with my hands on the wheel, and I couldn't feel them. He had projected 23 deaths. He had written the number down. He had budgeted for it. I sat there and my chest got tight, and I started shaking, and I couldn't stop. I don't know how long, 15 minutes, 20. I wasn't crying, I was just breaking, I think. I turned the engine off and I listened to the semis go by, and I thought about Mirella bringing me muffins on Tuesdays, and I thought about my mother in chair 4, and I thought about the number 23, and how he had written it in an email with a comma and a period and a subject line, the way you'd write about office supplies. I started the truck. I drove home. I didn't tell my wife about it until weeks later. The grand jury indicted him on December 3rd, 2024. 34 counts. 4 of them, negligent homicide. The worst thing I ever said out loud in my life, I said when the phone rang with the news. I won't tell you what it was. It wasn't a celebration. The hospital lost its Medicare certification on December 9th. That's about 1/3 of its operating revenue. They got it back in April after a full reconstruction of the water treatment system, the dialysis unit's entire equipment stack, and a new chief executive. Gavin Holcomb took a plea deal in February. 10 years in federal prison, no parole. He lost his house. His wife moved to Cleveland. His son transferred schools. 23 settlements came down in summer 2025. The amounts aren't mine to share. Mirella Voss's daughter, who lives in Columbus, sent me a letter in March. I still have it. It's on a note card with a library bird on the front. The only line I'll share is this one. She wrote, "My mother thought you were one of the kind ones. She wasn't wrong, just slow." She wasn't wrong, just slow. That's the line that I'll never get to walk away from. I don't want to. I deserve to carry it. Here's the thing I've sat with since all of this, and it's under 20 words because I don't trust a long version of it. Silence isn't neutral. Silence is a decision. I made mine for 18 months. I'm not saying that to make you feel bad if you've ever made one. I'm saying it so I don't forget. Ilana took a job at a different hospital in June. She took a pay cut. She said, "I can't stand on that floor." My mother's transplant came through in August of 2025. She is alive. I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning the following spring, because I don't want the story to end with indictments. I was working. I had taken a job at a community clinic on the other side of Chillicothe, fixing equipment for about 40% of what Adina used to pay me. I didn't care. It was a clinic that needed me more than I needed the paycheck. That morning, I was calibrating an infusion pump in a back room, and a woman walked in. Late 50s, gray cardigan, librarian glasses, and she just kind of hovered in the doorway until I turned around. She said, "Are you Jude Pickering?" I said I was. She said, "My sister was Odalis Mercado." She didn't say anything else for a minute. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there with a screwdriver in my hand like an idiot. Then she walked over and hugged me. No words, just about 30 seconds of hug, in a room with a broken infusion pump on a Tuesday. When she pulled back, she said, "I'm not going to thank you. My sister is still dead, but I wanted you to see my face." I said, "Okay." She walked out. I went home that night, and I sat on the porch. My daughter came out and sat next to me. She's 13 now. She said, "Dad, are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, honey, I'm okay." And we sat there on the porch until it got dark, and the fireflies came out over the grass, and she leaned against my shoulder. My wife came out around 9 with 3 glasses of lemonade, and we just sat there. Lemonade, fireflies, my daughter's weight against my shoulder, nothing else. Last month I drove past the hospital. It's operational again. New CEO, new dialysis unit. There's a plaque in the lobby with the names of the 23 patients. My wife asked me if I'd been able to look at it. I told her I hadn't, not yet. In the employee lot where I parked my truck for 12 years, Gavin Holcomb's reserved spot is still labeled CEO. The hospital hasn't repainted it, but there's a different car in it now. I saw Holcomb once, in person, after the indictment. Not in court. At a Kroger in the town where his wife's family is from, about an hour from here. I'd driven up for a cousin's funeral. He was at the deli counter ordering cold cuts. His hair was longer. He was wearing a windbreaker. He looked up. He saw me. We looked at each other across the deli counter, the kind of way 2 people look at each other when there's nothing to say. Then he turned back to the counter and said to the man behind the glass, quietly, "Could I have the turkey, please?" And the man said, "How much?" And Holcomb said, "I'm not sure. Let me think about it." That's the last thing I ever heard him say. He paid. He walked out. He got into a sedan I didn't recognize. His hands were on the steering wheel for about a minute before he started the car. I stood there in the aisle. I listened for a while, I guess, to nothing. The kind of listening you do when you've just seen something you'll remember for a long time. I don't know what I was waiting for. Probably I wasn't waiting for anything. Probably I was just standing in an aisle in a grocery store, holding a box of cereal, at 47 years old, on a Tuesday afternoon, and not carrying a binder anymore. Thank you for sitting with me through all of this. This story isn't easy for me to tell because there are long stretches of it that aren't about the villain. They're about me, and a locker, and 18 months of silence. If you stayed through the slow part, you gave me something I can't really name. Hit subscribe so I can keep telling the stories that don't have easy narrators. A like before you go tells me you want more of this kind of story, not the clean kind. I want to ask you one question, not a rhetorical one. Is there a drawer in your life with a blue binder in it? Something you already know is true and haven't admitted yet? You don't have to name it. Just say what shape it is if you feel safe. I read every one. I'm Jude Pickering. The water at Adina Riverview is clean now. The man who poisoned it is in a federal facility in Pennsylvania. My mother is asleep in her own bed tonight. If you have a binder, open it. That's all I've got. Take care of yourselves.